Hello, everyone. Good morning from Minnesota to you. So I have just really a couple slides. The main thing I'll cover here would be these topics today in Creo Illustrate. So it certainly seems like we have folks who are familiar with Creo Illustrate on the call today. But I'm just going to start out with a very basic overview, and then we'll jump into some of the new features that Jeff mentioned and that are available in the current release. So I will be using Creo Illustrate 6.1 today. And then, like I said, we'll go through some tips and tricks here for Creo Illustrate that I find useful, and also some new features. So the first thing we'll start off with is, like I said, a very basic overview. And the first thing I'll cover here would be kind of the differences between an open command or an import command within Creo Illustrate. Open is going to open Creo Illustrate project files, and an import is what we're going to use to bring in source geometry. So if I start here, I have nothing loaded. This is a brand new session. If I want to start for creating a new illustration or drawing, I'll use the import command. And within the import command, you have two options. So you have embed and link. And an embed will bring in a static copy of that source file, and a link will bring in a dynamic link to that file. So if I choose link here and I grab my source geometry, it will ask me how I want to manage this. And what Creo Illustrate is doing is this is actually going to check and see if that geometry has updated. So in my demo example here, I'm just bringing in content from my local computer. But if I were to be using Windchill, I would bring in a link to a source file from Windchill. So we have the new figure box here. So by default, it's going to ask us, do we want to create a new figure? What kind of geometry? So we will create a figure here. And within Creo Illustrate, again, just as a basic overview, how the project file works is I have my project file, and within that I can create any number of figures. And so we could think of a figure as an individual illustration. Another view you can have of what that looks like, if I go to the File Info window, what we can see here is all of the information about my linked sources. So here's that source file I just brought in, and I can see here a status of that link. So I could go ahead and update that. I can check for an update. I can also change my policy on how I want this to update. Or if I wanted to, I could also come in and unlink this from its source, creating a static copy like I had embedded that. So this is a useful window. I can bring in more than one source object as well, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But that would allow me to, say, change the seat on my tractor, or bring in an assembly fixture or tooling, perhaps, for use for creating my illustrations. And then what we'll see here is I have all of my sources managed, and then I can create multiple figures underneath there. So I haven't saved anything yet, but when I would save things, they would populate this information over here. So just a useful tip, if you're working with multiple sources, you want to check to see if things are up to date, you can do that through this information window right here. Moving on with kind of the basic overview here, you'll notice here that I don't have an image associated with this figure. In Creo Illustrate, that is called my figure view. And I can set that using this command here, and you'll see that populate. And what that does is that sets my, you could think of that as your home location within this figure. So if I move and I zoom around, I can go back to that saved figure view. And this becomes very useful when I think about publishing to a two-dimensional output from Creo Illustrate. So I can create my exploded view, I can move my parts around, and I can come in here and set that as my home location for this view. And then even if I move around in 3D, when it actually publishes, it's going to use this orientation that I've set. So that's a useful little tip. I say often new users are unfamiliar with what that actually does. Essentially, it's your home location for this figure for the camera. Okay, also just basic understanding here. When I bring in my source data, Creo Illustrate will mirror that structure. So a lot of our tips today is going to be working with this structure within my Creo Illustrate. So Creo Illustrate labels that as my SBOM. You could also think of that as your illustration bill of materials. But you can see when I select on a part, it will highlight within this list. I can turn parts on or off using the checkboxes here. So this is a great way just to interact with my model at a structural level, and it certainly interacts with the 3D environment too. Okay, let me bring that back together. And let's get to my list here. So my first thing I have as a new feature is the decal functionality. And the decals are a really neat thing that have been added here. So I'll just do a quick little demonstration here. You can see I have a decals drop down. And let me, here we go. All right, so let's start here. Just a simple example here of a decal. So if I say add a decal to my part, it will ask me here in the little wizard to select the part that the decal is going to be placed on. So if I select this outer housing, then what I can do is I can click and place my decal. And pretty simple here to, I can resize this and move this around on my part. So here's a quick example here of just a static decal. Now that decal is going to live on the part itself. So for instance, if I were to select on this part and go to the properties, under appearance, we can see that I have this decal applied. So if I needed to come in here and edit this, I can do that from this window. I can also remove it. Another place I can get back is if I go to within Creo Illustrate, whenever you select on something, you will have tabs that appear depending on the available commands. So there will be a Parts tab, and on this Parts tab, I can see the decal command again. So there's a couple places I can access the decal, but if I go to Edit, I'd be able to come in here and select back on this guy, and I can move this now and change its settings here as well. Another cool thing is that I can apply decals to non-flat surfaces within Creo Illustrate. So let me bring in another example. And I can use what is called a mapping shape. And a mapping shape would be a type of geometry to place this decal. So if I want to put this fish on here, I can choose different types of shapes. So in this example, a cylinder would be really perfect for this type of 3D assembly. And you can see it is orienting that cylinder vertically, and I have my parts dragger, so I can rotate that to match the cylinder barrel of my parking brake. And another little tip here, whenever you're rotating, if you hold down your control key, it will snap that to 90-degree increments. So that's useful. I can also dynamically drag that. And if I wanted to, while holding down my mouse button, I can type in a value and hit enter, and it will snap to that value too. A little trick there. So I can set my cylinder shape, and then I can position this within that shape. So just a little trick there. And if you've ever wanted to see a fish on a parking brake, well, now you have. That's a new capability. Really cool to be able to put decals, warning labels, or physical labels that might actually be on your products. You can render those, and a pretty neat capability there. All right. So the next thing I have is really talking about this tool here, or the tools that are under the edit structure capability of Creo Illustrate. And this is a tool that's available in some of the higher licensed capabilities of Creo Illustrate. But what this allows you to do is I can work with that illustration or SBOM illustration structure that lives within my drawing. So by default, what we're looking at here is in this panel here, this is my source geometry structure. And on the left-hand side, this is what is contained within Creo Illustrate. And the Creo Illustrate bill of material is editable, meaning that I can create my own version of this structure that will update appropriately, but those changes only exist within Creo Illustrate. So this is a really, really useful capability. This will allow me to come in here and I could say, for instance, that we want to create a child part. And let's call this our hardware kit. So I can come in and create a new part, and I can select parts now. So let's grab these bolts. And you'll see they'll highlight in my source bill of material, and I can drag and drop those into my hardware kit. And these parts themselves now will know where they live. So if I select on this part, you can see I have a select an EBOM or source bill of material. And if I have select an SBOM, it will go back and find that part. So it's still linking the 3D geometry, but I have the ability here to create a structure that might be a little easier for me to use as an illustrator within Creo Illustrate. Another type of command we have here is the combine command. So I'm going to make a new part, and we'll call this the cover. And this is useful for, let's say I have parts that are maybe from an illustration, or if I'm doing, say, a service illustration, they might be welded, a welded assembly. So these two parts that are combined within my cover, maybe from an illustration perspective, are always joined together. And what I can do is say, I want to combine those parts, and practically what that does is that will lock them together. So they will interact with each other and combine themselves to their parent assembly level. So another useful functionality there. Something additionally we can do, just moving through my menu UI, would be I could come in here and rename this. So again, this changes only in Creo Illustrate. But if we come in here and rename that, I can give that a more easily readable name from an illustration perspective. Likewise, this part here is a CAD assembly part. I can remove that from my bill of materials if that's a part that I'm not using. And this type of functionality is really useful and can make things very simple and easy just working within Creo Illustrate. So I'll show you a couple other things here. For comparing your source file here with what you have loaded in Creo Illustrate, there are several filters you can apply. So for instance, if I come on my source BOM side, I can show there's a field here for parts that might not be in SBOM. And if I run this query, I just removed this skeleton part. So it is showing that that part does not exist within this bill of material. So that is useful. Another useful command is this replace part. So if I have, say, an update to my linked source file and there's a new part or a replacement, this command will go through and replace that part structurally with a new part number that might come from my source. So another very useful tool. As last thing I'll talk about here, just to not go into too much depth, would be I can save this structure that I create to an XML file. And that would be this export command here. So this cover and hardware kit, we come in here and let me just save that to my desktop. Now what I could do, if I bring in the same source geometry into another illustration and we remove, let's remove everything here, I can bring that back in from that file that I just exported. So here's my parking brake with those changes that I just applied. Other things that are really cool that you can do in the edit structure mode would be there's this color code view which gives you an idea of what parts may or may not be transferred. But the other thing I can do with color is I can set the default color for parts within this application. So if I select on a part here And it's important to remember that they're only editable when you select them on the SBOM side, so I'll use my Select an SBOM tool. I can set the color for this part, and that will change that for all figures that this part is visible. So it's not changing it only in the figure. You could think of this at your global or your project file level for changing part color. Likewise, I can change the home location of these parts for when I say restore location. So if I take a part here, and again, we have to select it in the SBOM to make it editable. If I move this part, we can see that I have a new command. So what I can do is I can change the SBOM home part location, and I also have the ability to remember the original location these came in from my source 3D geometry. But if I wanted to edit the location of a part, I can do that. And similarly, I could use this assemble command to have a more precise way of moving these parts or changing their home part location. So just a quick demo of the assemble command. I have this bolt selected. I can choose a 3D surface or geometry. So if I choose the face of the head of that bolt and say, for instance, on this guy, we want the head of that bolt, they will mate together. So a nice simple tool for assembling parts. I have offsets and rotations and some different ways I can assemble these. But within the edit structure command, that is a way that I can set now the home location for this bolt. So when I say close edit, what we'll see here is I now have my updated structure. You can see I have my purple coupling, and I have this bolt reoriented within my graphic or illustration. Next on my agenda here, sorry, just looking at my notes, we have the selection set. So Jeff mentioned these. This is a new functional way to do a similar procedure for grouping content. So I can certainly edit my structure. However, something that might be helpful or useful to me would be, say if I have parts that I want to select. So let's grab maybe this coupling here, or some of these parts, let's say. If I go to this parts menu, I can create a selection set. So this would be a default selection set. So let's call this maybe parts group 1, for instance. And if I open up my secondary data panel, I now see selection sets. So these parts have been added to this group. And essentially, this is just a nice way to interact with and quickly grab a group of parts. So if I want all these parts, I can quickly grab them from this menu. If we wanted to add something to this menu, again, I can say add to, and it will find my selection set. So a really useful tool, something that was recently added to Creo Illustrate, but a really nice quick way to work with and group objects for easy and quick selection. The last thing I'll talk about here would be working with part attributes. Actually, I have two things, apologies. So something else, I talked about the figure view. You also have an orientation view dropdown, and I can add in my own custom view angles. So for instance, if you open up this custom view orientation, you can specify your own camera orientation. So I labeled this one Scott, but you could configure this to be your own view. So if you wanted kind of a standardized, in this example, it's a semi-isometric view. I can save that to this view orientation, and then when I create my figure view, I can use that as my home view. But something else that I get asked about would be if I can create my own custom camera orientation or view. And then the last thing I'll talk about here, and Jeff mentioned some newer capabilities around this, but I also have the ability to work with part attributes in Creo Illustrate. So if I select on a part, we can see here that I have the ability here apologies. There we go. So if I go to my attribute pane, I can select on the attribute here, and I have an attributes pop-up that comes up. And there are capabilities for working with and adding attributes to your parts. So a simple example here would be, let's say I want to add in a new part attribute. So maybe this is my, and we can add this, make a new category, and we'll call this, you know, this is our demo value. So I have the ability to work with and add in attributes. And let me uncombine this part. And so now when I'm done with my attribute edit, I should also mention that I can export my attributes as well. We will see here that value is now part of this attribute. And these attributes can be used to build, I can have callouts that come off of these. So if we come in and say that we want to have a custom callout, we want to add one in here. I have the ability to insert attributes as part of this callout. So here's my callouts coming in from CAD. Here's that custom attribute that I just created. But I could use anything that's written with my CAD drawing or something that I add to this. So, you know, these would all be possible. And then what I can do is insert the name, and it will pull in the attribute name and also the value of that part. And then within this window, I can add in, you know, so if I want the name and a space and then the attribute, I can save that as a callout template style. So now callout 11 here, again, we'll have that capability. So when I come in here and say we want to use callout 11, it will pull in that attribute. So here's our demo attribute based off of that callout style. And if I were to say on this part, you know, we want that same attribute, it doesn't find that. So, and that's because I only applied that attribute to one part here. So that's my kind of some tips and tricks here for some new functionality or some things I get asked about often within Creo Illustrate.